I transmigrated into a novel. I became the real heir in a story about a fake and real son. Not only did my father dislike me and my mother neglect me, even my fiancée Willow fell for the fake heir. She humiliated me in every possible way just to break off our engagement. So, I joined forces with the vicious male supporting character. Together, we formed a powerful alliance. We swore to bring down the Liu family and seize control of the Wang Corporation. Watching me use the Ito family's backing to act arrogantly, Wang's father was furious. He pointed at me and cursed. "You ungrateful bastard who has forgotten your roots. Do you even remember what your surname is?" I honestly replied, "My surname is Wang, but it's not the Wang from your family." Chapter 1. George woke up to a slap across his face. Sharp, loud. The entire living room fell silent for a moment. The woman standing before him wore a beige maxi dress. Her makeup was exquisite. Her eyes were red, and her hand remained suspended in midair. It seemed even she hadn't expected herself to actually hit him. But soon, that trace of guilt was overwhelmed by anger. "George Wang, you've disappointed me so much." Her voice trembled, filled with barely restrained disgust. "Tony's health is already poor. Why did you have to provoke him?" George slowly raised his eyes. The living room was packed with people. Sitting in the main seat of the sofa was a middle-aged man with a stern face and an intimidating presence. His expression was dark and gloomy. Standing beside him were three young women. One was cold and elegant, dressed in a professional suit. One was aloof and refined, still wearing a white coat as if she had rushed straight back from the hospital. One was bright and flamboyant, wearing sunglasses. Even at home, she looked like she was always ready to be captured by a camera. And in the center of everyone's attention sat a pale-faced young man. His head was lowered, his fingers clutching the blanket tightly, tears falling one drop at a time. "Mom, don't blame brother. It's my fault. I shouldn't have stayed in the Wang family." After saying that, he coughed twice, his body swaying slightly. Immediately, everyone rushed toward him. "Tony, don't get worked up. The doctor said you can't take any stress." "George, what are you waiting for? Apologize to Tony." George didn't move, looking at the scene before him. His mind felt as if an entire book had been forcefully stuffed into it. He had transmigrated. He had entered a modern-day novel about a real and fake heir. Except, he wasn't the protagonist of a satisfying revenge story. He had become the most miserable cannon fodder, the real heir who was doomed to suffer in the original story. The original owner was also named George Wang. 18 years ago, the wealthy Wang family of City A accidentally switched babies. The Wang family's biological son was left outside, while their adopted son Tony enjoyed 18 years of luxury and privilege in the Wang household. 3 months ago, the Wang family finally found George, but after truly returning to the Wang family, George discovered that no one here welcomed him. His biological father, Walter, thought he was crude, gloomy, and incapable of appearing in high society. His biological mother, Sandra, believed that his return had made Tony feel insecure. His eldest sister, Flora, the vice president of the Wang Corporation, only acknowledged the younger brother she had grown up with, Tony. His second sister, Lillian, a cardiac surgeon, believed Tony's health was fragile and everyone should accommodate him. His third sister, Laura, a famous young actress in the entertainment industry, hated George's look of someone who had come to collect a debt. As for Tony, on the surface, he appeared weak and kind, but in reality, he was ruthless and calculating. Knowing that he wasn't their biological son, Tony started pretending to be sick, playing the victim, sowing discord, and framing George from the very first day George returned. And unfortunately, everyone in the Wang family fell for it. The original George had grown up starved for affection. He believed that as long as he was obedient enough and gave in enough, sooner or later he would earn even the slightest bit of love from his family. So he became a simp. He begged for his parents' affection. He begged for his sister's approval. He begged for his fiancée's love. Even toward Tony, the fake heir who had taken his place, he kept giving in again and again. But what happened in the end? In the original story, Tony framed George for stealing something, causing the Wang family to throw him out. Then his fiancée broke off their engagement and humiliated him publicly. Later, Tony stole his paintings, took his projects, and claimed credit for saving someone's life that George had actually done. George tried to explain, but no one believed him. Finally, to completely eliminate him, Tony arranged a car accident. George died in a storm. Before his death, he called every member of the Wang family. No one answered. Only Laura replied with a message. "Stop pretending. Tony is still in the hospital. Can you stop causing trouble for no reason?" The original George never received an apology before he died. Thinking of this, George slowly raised his hand and touched his aching cheek. The pain was real. The people standing before him were real too. And now, the plot had reached the moment when Tony framed him for the first time. Chapter 2. Today was the Wang family's private family banquet. Tony deliberately threw himself down the stairs, then cried and claimed that George had pushed him. The original George desperately tried to explain. No one believed him. In a fit of rage, Sandra slapped him. According to the original storyline, under everyone's pressure, the original George would apologize to Tony with tears in his eyes. From that day onward, he would completely lose his standing in the Wang family. George lowered his eyes and let out a laugh. Good. He hadn't arrived too late. At least he wasn't dead yet. Seeing that he remained silent, Sandra became even angrier and said, "What are you laughing at?" George looked up and calmly stared at her. "I'm laughing at how stupid you all are." The living room fell silent. Sandra froze. Walter slammed his hand on the table. "George." His eldest sister Flora frowned. "Do you even know what you're saying?" His third sister Laura completely exploded. Furious, she shouted, "You pushed Tony and now you're insulting people. George, you're hopeless." A trace of shock flashed through Tony's eyes. This wasn't how George was supposed to react. He should have panicked. He should have explained himself. He should have begged them to believe him. How dare he speak like this? George didn't even look at Tony. He bent down and picked up his phone from the coffee table. The screen was already shattered. Laura had smashed it earlier. The reason was simple. She thought George had attacked Tony and was recording it with his phone, proving that he was scheming. But she didn't know that the original George really had started recording. Not to hurt anyone. It was because during these 3 months, he had been framed too many times. He had finally learned to keep evidence. Unfortunately, in the original story, before he could show the video, Laura destroyed his phone, and under everyone's pressure, he broke down and apologized. But now, a broken phone didn't mean the data was gone. George unlocked the phone and connected it to the cloud. A few seconds later, the video was projected onto the living room TV. In the footage, the staircase entrance was completely empty. George stood at the other end of the hallway, at least 5 meters away from Tony. Tony first looked around, then he threw himself down the stairs, halfway through rolling down. He even deliberately adjusted his position to make sure he wouldn't actually injure any vital parts. At the end of the video, he lay on the floor and weakly called out, "Brother, why did you push me?" The living room became deathly silent. The anger on Sandra's face froze. Walter's brows furrowed tightly. Flora stared at the video, her expression growing darker little by little. Lillian instinctively looked at Tony. Laura opened her mouth, but not a single word came out. Tony's face turned pale, truly pale this time. He shook his head in panic. "No, that's not how it happened. The video must have been edited. Brother, why would you treat me like this?" George turned off the video. He smiled. "Keep acting." Tony's tears immediately fell. "I'm not acting." He turned to Sandra. "Mom, I really didn't." Sandra's lips moved slightly. She had just slapped George, but the evidence proved that George hadn't touched Tony. Yet admitting she was wrong immediately was something she couldn't bring herself to do. So she could only say, "Even if Tony wasn't pushed by you, you still shouldn't have spoken with that attitude." George laughed. "So the truth doesn't matter. What matters is that my attitude was bad." Sandra's face turned slightly pale. Flora spoke up. "Mom doesn't mean that." George looked at her. "Then what does she mean?" Flora was speechless. George slowly walked to the center of the living room, looking at the familiar yet unfamiliar faces of the Wang family. He spoke calmly. "Tony threw himself down the stairs, and you said I pushed him. The evidence came out, and now you say my attitude is the problem. Next, are you going to say that even though I didn't push him, Tony's insecurity is still because I came back? So in the end, it's still my fault?" No one spoke, because that was exactly what they had been thinking. George nodded. "Understood." Sandra suddenly felt uneasy. She asked, "Understood what?" George picked up his coat from the sofa. "Understood that this family doesn't need me," Walter said coldly. "What are you trying to do this time?" George looked at him and said, "Nothing." Cutting ties. Chapter 3. The moment those words fell, the expressions of everyone in the Wang family changed. Laura was the first to sneer. "Cut ties? Who are you trying to scare? Do you think the Wang family is somewhere you can come and go as you please?" George looked at her. "Of course I'm leaving. After all, the Wang family hasn't really given me anything in these 3 months. Laura's expression darkened. "You eat Wang family's food, live in Wang family's house, and you still have the nerve to say we gave you nothing?" George replied calmly. "The room I stayed in was a guest room next to the storage room on the first floor. I used Tony's old furniture that he didn't want anymore. During meals, you all thought I was an eyesore, so you had the servants deliver food to my room. As for money," he took out a supplementary card from his wallet and placed it on the table. "The day you gave me this card, Laura, you said that I couldn't wait to spend the Wang family's money the moment I came back. So I haven't used a single cent. Want to check the account?" Laura's face stiffened. She never expected that George would remember something she had casually said so clearly. Lillian frowned. Laura was just speaking without thinking. She didn't mean any harm. George looked at her and shrugged. Tony throwing himself down the stairs was because his health was poor. Laura smashing my phone was because she spoke without thinking. Sandra slapping me was because she was angry in the moment. Walter not asking for the truth was because he was considering the bigger picture. But when it comes to me, suddenly I'm the cruel one, the troublemaker, the unreasonable one. His tone remained calm, but every sentence felt like a slap across the faces of the Wang family. Sandra's eyes turned red. George, Mom was just too worried earlier. George corrected her. Mrs. Sandra, don't call me that. Sandra froze. George said. It disgusts me when I hear it. Sandra's face instantly turned pale. Walter shouted angrily. George, watch your attitude. George ignored him. He picked up his phone and opened the recording function. I've already recorded what I said about cutting ties. Starting today, I voluntarily leave the Wang family. I won't take a single cent from the Wang family, and I will no longer identify myself as the Wang family's young master. Likewise, from now on, no one from the Wang family is allowed to ask me to do anything under the name of family ties. After finishing, he pressed save. Flora frowned deeply. You don't have to go this far. George looked at her. Yes, I do, because soon, you'll realize just how useful I am, and by then, I'm afraid you'll come crawling back and disgust me. Flora's expression darkened, but George had already turned around and walked out. Tony suddenly called out to him, Brother. George stopped. Tony's eyes were red as he said, Don't leave. Okay, it's all my fault. I can move out. He sounded pitiful. If it were the original George, he probably would have softened again, but George only looked back at him. Tony, your acting is too fake. Tony's expression stiffened. George continued. And one more thing. Don't call me brother. It makes me nauseous. After saying that, he pushed open the door and left. Outside, the night was deep and dark. George stood on the steps and exhaled slowly. He knew this was only the beginning. In the original story, Tony's truly vicious side wasn't that he knew how to pretend to be pitiful. It was that he would slowly take everything away from the original owner. Family affection, reputation, engagement, artwork, career, and finally, his life. But now, things were different. He knew the entire script of this world. Tony would pretend to be sick. Then George would expose his medical records. Tony would steal his paintings. Then George would preserve evidence in advance. Tony would steal his projects. Then George would take them first. Tony would hire someone to kill him. Then George would set a trap beforehand and send those people behind bars. The Wang family loved their fake heir. Fine. Then they could take their fake heir and rot together in the mud. Chapter 4. After leaving the Wang family, George Wang went to a budget hotel in the city center. The original owner's bank account only had $4,700 left. This was money he had slowly saved from part-time jobs, drawing commissions, and design work. After the Wang family found him, they never truly cared about how he was living. They had given him a supplementary card, but that card felt more like charity. Everyone thought he should be grateful. The moment he actually used it, it would become evidence that he was after the Wang family's money. George took a shower and stood in front of the mirror, looking at this face. 19 years old, still very young. His features were handsome and refined, but years of suppression and poor nutrition had made him look slightly gloomy and thin. No wonder the Wang family looked down on him. But George knew the original owner wasn't useless. He had an exceptional talent for painting and a sharp sense for business. In the original story, Tony later became incredibly successful, but it wasn't because he was truly capable. It was because he kept stealing everything that belonged to the original George. And the most important first thing was the Liu family banquet 3 days later. The Liu family was the family that had arranged George Wang's engagement. The daughter of the Liu family, Willow Liu, was also the fiancée the original George had spent years chasing after. Before the Wang family found him, George had once saved Willow by accident. At the time, Willow didn't know his identity and only thought this poor boy was annoying. Later, after learning that George was the real heir, she briefly changed her attitude toward him. But after Tony appeared, she was quickly attracted to him again. A frail yet talented young master, Tony was very good at manipulating women's sympathy. At the Liu family banquet 3 days later, Willow would publicly propose breaking off the engagement. Her reason would be that George had terrible character, bullied Tony, and was unworthy of becoming her fiancé. The original George would be overwhelmed by the shock and question her in front of everyone whether she liked Tony. As a result, he would become the laughingstock of the entire crowd. Willow would even say that famous line, George, even if you are the real heir, you still can't compare to Tony in the slightest. From that day on, the original George became a joke in City A's elite circle. Thinking of this, George opened his computer. Since he knew the plot, he obviously wouldn't wait to be abandoned. If the engagement was going to end, he would be the one to end it first. George logged into the email account and found a document saved by the original owner. It was the complete marketing strategy for a new product launch under the Willow Corporation. In the original story, the Willow Corporation's cash flow ran into trouble, and Willow begged the original George to help stabilize the company. He stayed up for more than 10 nights and created this entire plan for her. The Willow Corporation relied on this strategy to survive the crisis. But in the end, the credit went to Tony. Willow said, "Tony only helped me polish it a little. Don't be so petty." The Wang family members also said, "A man shouldn't always be so obsessed with every little thing." George looked at the document and laughed. Since that was the case, there was no reason to leave this plan with the Willow family. He spent 2 hours reorganizing the strategy, removing all details that could reveal the original owner's habits, then sent it to the biggest competitor of the Willow Corporation, the Ito Group. The email title was simple: Strategic Weaknesses in Willow Corporation's New Product Launch and Countermeasure Plan. Half an hour later, he received a reply. "Who are you?" George replied, "The person who can make the Willow Corporation's new product launch fail." The other side was silent for 10 minutes. Then came a reply: "Come to Ito Group headquarters tomorrow at 10 a.m. George closed his computer. That was more like it. People couldn't keep chasing after others' love forever. Money and control over one's own destiny were the most reliable things. The next morning at 9:30, George arrived at the Ito Group building. The Ito Group was one of City A's rising powers. Over the years, it had fiercely competed with the Willow Corporation in the beauty and personal care industry. The Willow Corporation built its success on traditional distribution channels, while the Ito Group specialized in new media strategies. The launch 3 days later was the Willow Corporation's most important battle of the year. If it failed, the Willow Corporation's cash flow would collapse completely. Chapter 5. George had just walked into the hall when he saw a man in a black suit waiting there. The man looked to be around 30 years old, with a cold and imposing aura. "Mr. Wang." George nodded. "Yes, that's me. Mr. Ito is waiting for you upstairs." George followed him upstairs. Inside the conference room, the president of the Ito Group, Makoto Ito, sat in the main seat. He looked to be in his late 20s, with sharp features and deep eyes. George's proposal from last night was placed on the table. Makoto skipped the pleasantries and got straight to the point. "You made this proposal?" George sat down. "Yes. What do you want?" "Money." Makoto raised an eyebrow. George calmly said, "5 million. I'll sell you the rights to this countermeasure plan." The assistant beside him frowned. "Mr. Wang, do you understand what 5 million means?" George looked at him. "I do. Compared to the market share that will be left behind after Willow Corporation's new product fails, 5 million is cheap." The assistant was about to say something else. Makoto raised his hand to stop him. Then he asked, "What makes you so certain that Willow Corporation will follow the route you predicted?" George replied, "Because they have no other choice." He took out a printed document and pushed it forward. Willow Corporation's current distribution costs are too high, their offline payment cycle is too long, and their inventory pressure has already reached its limit. They have to rely on this product launch to generate a wave of pre-sale cash flow, so they will definitely promote a high-end repair concept, focus on emergency solutions for sensitive skin, and invite 3 top influencers to endorse the launch. Makoto's eyes changed slightly. George continued, "The problem is that their core ingredient selling point isn't unique enough, and their clinical data isn't convincing enough. As long as Ito Group releases a similar low-priced alternative line 3 days in advance and publishes comparison reviews, Willow Corporation will fall into 2 dilemmas: sell at a high price, and they'll be accused of exploiting customers; lower the price, and their high-end positioning will collapse." The conference room fell silent. Makoto looked at him. "Do you have a grudge against the Willow family?" George said. "Almost." Makoto smiled slightly. "You're quite straightforward." George replied. "Mr. Ito wants results, not a story." Makoto leaned back in his chair. 5 million. Deal. The assistant looked shocked. "Mr. Ito." Makoto Ito didn't look at him. He only stared at George. "But I want to know whether you're worth this price." George opened his laptop and projected the complete proposal onto the screen. "Give me 20 minutes. 20 minutes later, no one in the conference room questioned him anymore. Makoto immediately ordered the finance department to transfer the money. After signing the contract, George received the first real startup capital of his life, 5 million. When he left the Ito Group, his phone already had more than 10 missed calls. Some were from the Wang family, some were from Willow. George opened WeChat. Willow had sent him a message. "Come to the Willow family's house tonight." Her tone sounded like an order. George glanced at it and didn't reply. A few minutes later, Willow sent another message. "George, I know you've seen it. Stop throwing a tantrum. Tony said a lot of good things about you last night. You should be grateful to him." George directly blocked her. The world became peaceful, but the peace didn't last long. An unfamiliar number called. George answered. Willow's voice came through, suppressing her anger. You blocked me. George replied indifferently. Is there something you need? Willow was momentarily speechless at his attitude. In the past, George had always been extremely careful around her. One sentence from her could make him happy for half a day. If she got angry, he would apologize all night. But now, he actually asked her if she needed something. Willow said coldly. Tonight is the Liu family banquet. Don't be late. George asked. Why should I go? You're my fiancée. Not anymore. The other end of the phone fell silent for a moment. Willow sounded as if she had heard a joke. What do you mean? George said. Breaking off the engagement. Willow's voice turned completely cold. George, are you trying to get my attention this way again? George chuckled. Willow, do you really think that highly of yourself? Willow froze. George continued. I'll go tonight, not to attend the banquet, but to end our engagement. After saying that, he hung up directly. Chapter 6. At 7 o'clock in the evening, the Liu family villa was brightly lit. Many prominent figures from City A had arrived. Willow wore a black evening gown, standing among the crowd with an air of beauty and pride. Tony had also come. He wore a white suit, his face still slightly pale. Standing beside Willow, he looked gentle and harmless. The two of them were talking quietly. Anyone who didn't know better would think they were the real couple. When George walked into the banquet hall, he immediately attracted countless gazes. Today, he had changed into a well-fitted black suit. With its sharp tailoring and his clean, composed aura, he no longer carried the desperate need for approval or gloomy expression from before. Instead, he looked cold and sharp. When Willow saw him, her eyes paused slightly. For the first time, she realized that George was actually very handsome. It was just that he had always kept his head lowered before, looking at her with an almost humble and submissive gaze, which instinctively annoyed her. But now, things were different. The way he looked at her was very calm. So calm that it was as if he were looking at a stranger. For some reason, Willow felt uncomfortable. Tony also noticed the change in George. He spoke gently. Brother, you're here. George ignored him. A trace of embarrassment flashed in Tony's eyes. Willow frowned. George, Tony is talking to you. George looked at her. So? Willow was speechless. Tony hurriedly said. Willow, it's okay. My brother is probably still angry with me. Willow's expression became even colder. George, can you be a little more mature? George laughed. Willow, I didn't come here tonight to listen to you lecture me. As he spoke, he took out an agreement from a document folder. The engagement termination agreement. I've already signed it. Willow Liu's expression changed. The surrounding guests also turned their attention over. The Liu family couple rushed over after hearing the commotion. Several members of the Wang family were also present. Walter's expression turned ugly. George, what kind of nonsense are you causing now? George didn't look at him. He simply handed the agreement to Willow. Sign it. Willow clenched her fingers. She had originally planned to announce the end of their engagement tonight in front of everyone. She had even prepared her speech. She wanted to tell everyone that George had terrible character, was narrow-minded, and was unworthy of being her Willow's fiancé. But she never expected that George would bring out the engagement termination agreement first. The initiative was suddenly no longer in her hands. Willow sneered. George, there's a limit to playing hard to get. George nodded. You don't have to sign. I can have my lawyer send a formal notice. Willow's father frowned. George, the engagement between our two families is not something to play around with. George looked at him. Uncle Liu, does the Liu family still have the mood to talk about an engagement? Willow's father's expression changed slightly. George smiled and asked, how is the new product launch going? A dark look flashed in Willow's father's eyes. Willow frowned. What do you mean? George said, nothing. I'm just reminding you not to spend all your attention on someone else's fake younger brother. Your company is about to have problems. Willow's expression turned ugly. George, stop cursing the Liu family. Tony spoke at the perfect moment. Brother, are you jealous because Willow and I talked a few times? After he said that, the expressions of the people around them became subtle. Willow even revealed a look that said she had expected this. George looked at Tony and suddenly smiled. He asked, do you like stealing my things that much? Tony's eyes immediately turned red. Brother, I didn't. George nodded. Then she's yours. Willow's expression changed drastically. George. George placed the engagement termination agreement on the table. Willow, from today onward, our engagement is over. You like Tony? Fine. But don't come looking for me again in the future. After saying that, he turned around and walked away. Chapter 7. Willow was so angry that her entire body trembled. She wanted to chase after him, but with all the guests present, she could only stand there. Tony lowered his voice to comfort her. Willow, don't be upset. My brother was just acting on impulse. Willow suppressed the uneasiness in her heart and said coldly. He'll come back and beg me. Tony lowered his eyes. Yeah, but for some reason, he felt uneasy, because George's expression just now didn't look impulsive. It looked like he truly didn't want her anymore. Meanwhile, as George walked out of the Liu family villa, his phone happened to receive a news notification. Ito Group announces the launch of a brand new repair skincare line tomorrow, targeting the high-value sensitive skin emergency care market. George looked at the notification and smiled faintly. The Liu family's trouble had begun. The next morning, the Liu Corporation's conference room was deathly silent. Ito Group's new product launch had come too suddenly. More importantly, their core concept, influencer strategy, and marketing approach had all precisely targeted the Liu Corporation's weakest points. The Liu Corporation had originally planned to take the high-end repair skincare route, with high product pricing and large profit margins. As long as the launch succeeded, they could quickly recover their cash flow. But Ito Group had released a lower-priced alternative line one step ahead, directly turning the concept of emergency care for sensitive skin into a mass-market demand. If Liu Corporation continued selling at a high price, consumers would accuse them of exploiting customers. But if they followed with price cuts, they would no longer be able to maintain their high-end positioning. Willow's father sat in the main seat, his expression terrifyingly dark. Who leaked the proposal? No one dared to speak. Willow stared at Ito Group's launch content on the screen, her hands and feet turning cold. She was far too familiar with these ideas, because many of the points in Liu Corporation's internal proposal were things she had once discussed with George. No, to be precise, George was the one who helped her organize them. Back then, Liu Corporation's new product direction was chaotic. The team couldn't reach an agreement, and she was so frustrated that she couldn't sleep. After learning about it, George stayed up for several nights and created a complete proposal for her. At the time, she didn't take it seriously. She even thought George was just using the opportunity to please her. Later, Tony saw that proposal and said that some parts could still be improved, so she casually gave Tony the credit. As for George, she only said one sentence, "It's all right." But now, Ito Group's counterattack was so precise. The first person Willow thought of was George. Willow's father looked at her. "Willow, did you show the proposal to anyone else?" Willow's face turned pale. "No, are you sure?" Willow clenched her hands. She wanted to say that George had seen it, but the words got stuck in her throat, because technically speaking, the original proposal had been created by George himself. Willow's father said coldly, "The launch 3 days from now can't proceed according to the original plan. Scrap everything and start over." The head of the marketing department's face turned pale. 3 days isn't enough time. Willow's father shouted angrily. "Even if it isn't enough, you have to do it." After the meeting ended, Willow immediately took out her phone and called George. The call couldn't get through. Her messages on WeChat couldn't be sent either. Only then did she remember that George had blocked her. An indescribable frustration surged through her. In the past, George had always been the one who contacted her first. "Good morning, good night, have you eaten? Don't work too hard." She found it annoying and rarely replied. But whenever she sent a simple "Are you there?" George would always reply instantly. Yet now, he actually ignored her. Willow borrowed her assistant's phone and called him. This time, it went through. The phone rang for a long time before George finally answered. "Who is this?" Willow gritted her teeth. "It's me." George's tone remained unchanged. "Do you need something?" Again, those words. Willow suppressed her anger. "Was Ito Group's move you're doing?" George let out a laugh. "Miss Liu, you need evidence before making accusations." "George, stop pretending. Then call the police." Chapter 8. Willow felt a tightness in her chest from being at a loss for words. "Do you really have to be like this?" George asked. "Like what?" Willow softened her voice slightly. "I know yesterday's engagement termination upset you, but you don't have to take your anger out on the Liu Corporation." George was silent for 2 seconds. Then he said, "Willow, did you forget that I was the one who ended the engagement first?" Willow's expression froze. George continued, "And besides, what does the Liu Corporation have to do with me?" Willow couldn't help saying, "That proposal was originally something you gave me." "Yes, so I'm not giving it to you anymore." Willow had never been treated by him this way before. She took a deep breath and said, "George, as long as you help the Liu family get through this crisis, I can pretend yesterday's engagement termination never happened." George laughed. "Are you treating this like a reward?" Willow's expression turned ugly. "Weren't you the one who always wanted to marry me?" George replied indifferently. "That was before." Willow's heart inexplicably tightened. George said, "Now I don't want to anymore." The call ended. Willow stared at her phone for a long time, unable to recover. For the first time, she realized that George might have truly changed. Meanwhile, George was already sitting in the Ito Group's conference room. Makoto pushed a contract toward him. The first step worked very well. There's a high chance Willow Corporation's product launch will be postponed. George opened the contract. Makoto Ito said. Ito Group needs an external strategic consultant. The monthly consulting fee is 300,000, with additional project bonuses calculated separately. George raised an eyebrow. Mr. Ito trusts me this much. Makoto replied. I trust results. George smiled slightly and signed his name. Makoto looked at him. You have connections with both the Wang family and the Liu family. The road ahead will be troublesome. George closed his pen cap and said indifferently. I'm not afraid of trouble. Makoto asked. Then what are you afraid of? George thought for a moment. I'm afraid they'll kneel too soon. Makoto was stunned for a moment, then laughed. Mr. Wang, you're more interesting than I expected. George didn't respond. He looked out the window. The skyscrapers of City A stood tall, and the sunlight was dazzling. In the original story, after today, George would become infamous because of the broken engagement. Willow would completely side with Tony. The Wang family would scold him for bringing shame upon them, and Tony would use the opportunity to step on him, becoming the gentle and kind victim in everyone's eyes. But now, everything had been reversed. The Liu family would fall into chaos first. Next, it would be Tony's turn. George opened his email. There was a new message inside. The electronic evidence platform had sent a confirmation notification. All of the original owner's paintings, source files, creative process records, and scanned drafts had been fully registered with timestamps. George looked at the email, his gaze turning cold. Tony's most proud identity as a genius artist would soon collapse. Chapter 9. Tony's most famous identity was not the Wang family's adopted son. It was being the most talented young painter of his generation in City A. At least, that was what the outside world believed. When he was 16, he won the Young Emerging Artist Award with a painting of white doves in a rainy night. At 17, his work Where It Belongs was purchased by the Wang Corporation for $3 million and displayed in the lobby of the headquarters. On his 18th birthday, Walter personally held a solo exhibition for him. The media called him the artistic prodigy raised in a wealthy family, gentle, pure, fragile, a genius. These labels piled onto Tony, making him the most popular figure among the wealthy young ladies of City A. But George knew, at least half of those artworks were not painted by Tony, and the most important one was Return to the Nest, which would soon be displayed at the City A Youth Art Exhibition. In the original story, Return to the Nest would win the Gold Award. Tony would use this painting to completely solidify his identity as a genius artist. When the original owner discovered that his work had been stolen, he went to confront Tony. Tony said, "Brother, I didn't know that was your painting. I just loved it too much." And what did the Wang family say? Tony didn't do it on purpose. It's just a painting. Why do you have to ruin his future? You're his older brother. What's wrong with giving it to him? In the end, the original owner was forced to sign a donation statement. He personally admitted that Return to the Nest was a gift he had given Tony. From then on, even his only valuable talent was taken away from him. George would not let that happen again. 3 days later, the preliminary list for the City A Youth Art Exhibition was announced. Tony's name was prominently listed. Entry: Return to the Nest. When George saw the list, he was in the Ito Group's conference room revising a marketing proposal. He only glanced at it once before forwarding the link to his lawyer. Prepare an infringement lawsuit. The lawyer quickly replied, "Mr. Wang, are you sure you want to send it now?" George replied, "Not yet. Wait until the day of the exhibition." Sending it now would only force Tony to withdraw the painting. Sending it on the day of the exhibition, that would be a public execution. Makoto sat across from him. Seeing the smile at the corner of George's lips, he asked, "The Wang family?" George closed his laptop. "The fake heir wants to steal my painting." Makoto raised his eyebrows slightly. "Do you need help?" George said, "Not for now. For someone like him, the humiliation only works if it happens in front of the people he cares about most." Makoto was silent for a moment before saying, "You really hate him." George looked out the window. "Not hate. It's that he owes the original George a life." Makoto didn't understand what he meant, but he didn't ask further. After several days, the Wang family finally realized that George truly wasn't coming back. At first, Walter was only angry. He thought George was throwing a tantrum. A poor kid who had spent 19 years outside and finally returned to the Wang family. How could he really be willing to leave? But days passed. George didn't beg for forgiveness. He didn't return home. He didn't use the Wang family's card. He didn't even answer their calls. Sandra began to panic. Every day, she asked the servants to check George's room. The room was empty. The bed had never been touched. The closet only contained a few old clothes. At that moment, she suddenly realized George had left almost no trace behind in the Wang family. Unlike Tony, Tony's paintings, trophies, photos, and gifts filled the entire villa. But after living in the Wang family for 3 months, George didn't even have a single family photo that belonged to him. Sandra sat inside George's small guest room. For some reason, her chest felt strangely heavy. Chapter 10. Flora pushed open the door and walked in. Mom. Sandra looked up. Flora, do you think George is still angry? Flora was silent for a moment before saying, he probably isn't angry. Sandra froze. Flora said, he just doesn't want us anymore. Sandra's eyes turned red. How can he not want us? I'm his mother. Flora didn't answer. If this had happened before, she would have also thought George was being unreasonable. But after seeing that video that day, she seriously thought back on the 3 months since George returned home. As his eldest sister, she really hadn't had many proper conversations with him. Every time George approached her, she instinctively became defensive, because Tony would be hurt. So she demanded that George be understanding, because Tony's health was poor. So she demanded that George give in. She had never asked whether George was hurt. She had never asked how much suffering he had endured during the 19 years he spent outside. Flora rubbed her temples. I'll go talk to him, Sandra immediately said. Tell him that if he comes back, Mom can change his room. Flora's movement paused. Change his room. This compensation sounded so insignificant that even she herself found it embarrassing. At the same time, Tony was standing inside the art studio, looking at Return to the Nest in front of him. In the painting, a black bird rested on a broken windowsill. Outside the window was a storm. Inside the room, there was no light. The brushwork of this painting was extremely powerful, oppressive, lonely, sharp. The first time Tony saw it, he knew this painting would definitely become famous. Unfortunately, it was painted by George. Tony was unwilling to accept it. Why? George had already spent 19 years living outside. Why could he still effortlessly possess such talent after returning? Tony had spent so many years pretending in the Wang family just to finally become loved by everyone. He absolutely couldn't let George take everything away. The studio door opened. Laura walked in. Tony, how is your preparation for the art exhibition going? Tony immediately hid the darkness in his eyes and revealed a gentle smile. Third sister, I'm a little nervous. Laura walked over. When she saw Return to the Nest, her eyes lit up. This painting has such a strong feeling. Tony lowered his head. It's nothing. I was just painting casually. Laura touched his head affectionately. You're just too humble. Someone like George can't even compare to a single finger of yours. Tony's eyes turned slightly red. Third sister, is brother still unwilling to come home? At the mention of George, Laura's expression turned cold. Don't worry about him. He's just trying to make us lower our heads and beg him. Once he suffers enough outside, he'll understand how good the Wang family is. Tony gently nodded, but for some reason, uneasiness kept growing in his heart. The scene of George showing the video that day had never left his mind. That look in his eyes. It was as if he had already known what Tony was going to do. Impossible. Tony quickly rejected the thought. George had only gotten lucky and happened to have recorded the video. This time was different. The original draft of Return to the Nest was already in his hands. George had no evidence. As long as the art exhibition ended, everything would become set in stone. Chapter 11. On the opening day of the City A Youth Art Exhibition, many media outlets arrived. Tony wore a white suit and stood in the center of the exhibition hall. His face was slightly pale, and his aura was clean and gentle. Many people gathered around him. The crowd discussed excitedly. Young Master Wang, this Return to the Nest is truly breathtaking. The sense of loneliness in it is incredibly strong. No wonder he's called a young genius. Tony smiled gently. Thank you. I just painted some of my emotions. Laura stood beside him proudly, taking photos with her phone. She posted an update on social media. My little brother is truly amazing. The attached picture was Tony standing in front of Return to the Nest. Soon, fans began commenting. Tony is so talented. This is what a true wealthy young master should look like. Their family's genes are incredible. Looking at the comments, Laura was in an excellent mood. She even thought of George. If George saw this scene, he would probably feel inferior. One was a genius raised with the love of the Wang family. The other was a crude real heir who had grown up outside, full of resentment. So what if they shared the same blood? Some differences were carved into one's very bones. Just then, a slight commotion came from the entrance of the exhibition hall. Laura looked up. Her expression immediately darkened. George had arrived. He wore a black suit, accompanied by a lawyer. Besides them, there was also the president of Ito Group, Makoto. When Tony saw George, his heart suddenly skipped a beat. Why was George here? Laura walked over in high heels and lowered her voice. George, what are you doing here? George glanced at her. I came to see my painting. Laura frowned. Your painting? George walked past her and stopped in front of Return to the Nest. Everyone around them turned to look. Tony's face turned pale, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Brother, do you like this painting too?" George said. Yes. Tony had just relaxed, but the next second, George continued. "After all, I painted it." The air instantly froze. Everyone was stunned. Laura was the first to react. "George, are you crazy? This is Tony's competition piece. What are you trying to do again?" George ignored her. He looked at the lawyer beside him. The lawyer stepped forward and took out some documents. "Everyone, I am Mr. George Wang's legal representative. We have already completed evidence preservation for the entire creation process of Return to the Nest, including the source files, drafts, scanned drafts, electronic timestamps, and notarized records. We are now officially submitting an infringement complaint to the organizers." The scene instantly erupted. The media immediately surrounded them. Tony's face turned completely pale. "Impossible." He shook his head. "Brother, why are you doing this? This is obviously my painting." George looked at him. "Yours." He opened his tablet. The first draft of Return to the Nest appeared on the screen. Below it was a timestamp. 3 years ago. Then came the second composition draft, the third color draft, the fourth lighting adjustment. Every version had detailed time records. There was even a video of the original George painting this piece inside a rented apartment. In the video, the young man looked thin and quiet, sitting under a dim desk lamp. Stroke by stroke, he painted the black bird standing in the storm. Chapter 12. The moment the footage appeared, the entire venue fell completely silent. Tony's lips trembled. This is fake," George asked. "Do you want to show everyone your creative process too?" Tony couldn't say a word. Of course he couldn't, because the only thing he had was the finished painting. Laura stared at the video, completely frozen. She instinctively said, "Could this be a misunderstanding? Tony might have just what?" George turned to look at her. "Just accidentally took my painting. Or just accidentally entered my painting into the competition. Or perhaps just accidentally signed his own name on my work." Laura's face turned pale. Those were exactly the words she had originally wanted to say, but when George said them first, they became unbearably sarcastic. The person in charge of the exhibition looked grim. "Mr. Tony, please explain." Tony's eyes turned red as he looked at Laura for help. "Third sister, I don't know. I really don't know. This painting was placed in my studio when the servants were organizing the art room. I thought." George interrupted him. "You thought what?" "You thought that once something was in your hands, it automatically belonged to you." Tony's entire body trembled. The media cameras were almost pushed right into his face. Makoto stood not far away, watching everything with a cold expression. He had seen plenty of ugly things in the business world, but someone as blindly biased and foolish as the Wang family, he had rarely encountered one. When Flora and Lillian arrived, the scene had already descended into chaos. On the large screen, George's painting process video was playing repeatedly. Flora stopped in place. It was the first time she had seen that version of George, not the George who lowered his head in the Wang family, carefully trying to please them, but the George quietly painting inside a rented apartment. He was very thin. There was a cold instant noodle cup sitting on the desk, but his eyes were incredibly focused, as if that piece of paper was the only thing he had left to hold onto. Flora's heart suddenly ached. She had never known George could paint, and he was actually this talented. Lillian also fell silent. She was a doctor and had always believed herself to be rational, but during these 3 months, it seemed that she had never truly gotten to know her own biological brother. Tony was disqualified from the competition. The organizers announced on the spot that they would re-examine all of his submitted works. The media headlines were quickly published. Wealthy family's fake heir suspected of stealing real heir's artwork. The Wang family's real and fake heir controversy escalates again. Genius painter persona collapses. Tony couldn't hold on any longer. He fainted on the spot. Laura shouted, "Tony!" Lillian immediately stepped forward to examine him. The scene became chaotic once again. George stood there, his expression completely unchanged. Laura looked up at him, her eyes filled with anger. "Are you satisfied now?" George looked at her and smiled. "Your brother stole my painting. I took back what belongs to me, and you're asking whether I'm satisfied?" Laura was speechless. Flora walked over and lowered her voice. "George, let's go home and talk about this." George laughed. "Miss Wang, I don't have a home." Flora Wang's face turned slightly pale. George looked toward the organizers. "I demand a public apology, restoration of my authorship, and legal action for the infringement." Flora frowned. "Do you really have to take it this far?" George looked at her. Eldest sister. This was the first time he had called her that after cutting ties with the Wang family. Flora's eyes inexplicably turned warm, but the next second, George said, "Don't make me think you've lost even the last bit of common sense." Flora froze in place. George said word by word, "He stole my artwork. not a toy belonging to the Wang family. I'm not here to discuss this with you. I'm here to inform you. After saying that, he turned around and left. Flora watched his back. For the first time, she clearly realized George truly would never turn back. Chapter 13. Tony was taken to the hospital. This time, he had genuinely fallen ill from anger and distress. The atmosphere in the Wang family's hospital room was terrifyingly heavy. Sandra sat beside the bed, holding Tony's hand as tears continuously fell. Walter stood by the window, his expression dark. Laura paced back and forth angrily. She said indignantly, "George has gone too far. Even if the painting really belonged to him, he shouldn't have humiliated Tony in front of so many media outlets." Flora looked at her. "Then what should he have done?" Laura froze. Flora said, "Privately come to us, and then let us persuade him to give the painting to Tony." Laura's expression turned ugly, because that was exactly what she had thought. Lillian said softly, "Laura, this time, Tony really was in the wrong." Laura looked at her in disbelief. "Second sister, you're defending George too?" Lillian tiredly rubbed her forehead. "I'm not defending anyone. The evidence is clear." Laura still wanted to argue. Walter said in a deep voice, "That's enough." The hospital room fell silent. Walter looked at Flora. "Contact the media and suppress the news." Flora said, "We can't suppress it." Walter's expression became even darker. Flora continued, "Makoto was there at the scene. The media outlets under Ito Group have already released an in-depth report. Right now, public opinion online is basically supporting George. If we forcefully suppress it, people will only think we're trying to cover something up." Sandra looked up, her eyes filled with helplessness. "Then what should we do?" Flora was silent for a moment before saying, "Publicly apologize." Laura shouted sharply, "No. How will Tony face people after this?" Flora looked at her coldly. "Then what about George? His painting was stolen. Does he not deserve to face people either?" Laura was left speechless. Sandra's lips trembled. "Flora, do you also think Mom was wrong?" Flora didn't answer, and that silence hurt Sandra more than any answer could have. She suddenly remembered what George had said when he left that day. "The person who regrets it won't be me." At that time, she had only thought George was being heartless, but now, she was beginning to feel uneasy. Her biological son seemed to have truly been pushed away by her. That night, Flora went to the hotel where George was staying. The front desk told her that George had already checked out. Flora called him. The call was hung up. She called again. It was hung up again. On the third attempt, the call was finally answered. "Do you need something?" George's voice was as calm as ever. Standing outside the hotel entrance, Flora suddenly didn't know how to begin. After a long silence, she said, "Where are you staying now?" George let out a small laugh. "Miss Wang, that's not something you need to ask." Flora felt a tightness in her chest. She said, "I'm just worried about you." There was silence on the other end for 2 seconds. Then George asked, "Worried about what?" "Worried that I won't have enough to eat. Worried that I won't sleep well. Or worried that without the Wang family, I won't be able to survive." Flora's throat tightened. "Little brother, don't call me that." George's voice turned cold. He said, "You and I aren't close." Flora's eyes became slightly red. From childhood until now, she had always been the most outstanding child in the Wang family. At the company, she was decisive and ruthless. At home, she was the eldest sister her younger siblings relied on. She had never lowered herself like this before, but facing George, for the first time, she felt powerless. She said, "The Wang family will give you an explanation for the painting." George replied, "No need, the lawyer will handle it." Chapter 14. Flora lowered her voice. "Tony, George interrupted her. "You're here to plead for him." Flora immediately said, "No," but she knew clearly in her heart, if George was willing to drop the lawsuit, things would indeed become much easier to handle. George noticed her silence. He let out a soft laugh. "Flora, look, the so-called explanations you people give always mean one thing, making me give in. Before, you made me give up family affection. Now, you want me to give up my artwork. Next, will you ask me to give up my life too?" Flora's face turned pale. She instinctively denied it. "I didn't mean that, but that's what you've always done." George's voice contained no anger, only calmness, and because of that calmness, his words felt even more like a blade. "Flora, don't contact me again. I told you before, the Wang family disgusts me." The call ended. Flora stood in the night wind, motionless for a long time. She suddenly remembered many small details. When George first returned home, he carried an old luggage bag in his hand. Standing at the doorway, he had nervously called her eldest sister. At that time, she had been in the middle of a video conference and only responded with a casual Later, George had prepared a company data analysis report for her. She never even looked at it, because Tony had said, "Could it be that brother wants to enter the company and compete for my position?" So she threw the report into a drawer. Thinking about it now, that report seemed very similar to Ito Group's recent market strategy. Flora's heart sank. She finally realized that she might have overlooked a truly capable biological younger brother, and their entire family had treated an adopted son full of lies as their precious treasure. Tony was not someone who would simply wait for death. After the art exhibition scandal, he appeared to be sick for 3 days, but in reality, he had been contacting online influencers and paid commenters the entire time. On the 4th night, countless posts suddenly appeared online. The real heir failed to enter the wealthy family and maliciously retaliated against the adopted son. George suspected of joining forces with Ito Group to suppress the Wang family. The painting theft incident involving Tony may have another side. Someone even exposed that George had been gloomy since childhood, had fought at school, stolen things, and extorted classmates. Those so-called pieces of evidence included chat records, blurry photos, and several edited videos. Soon, public opinion began to shift. Many people started criticizing George. The world of wealthy families is really complicated. Being the real heir doesn't necessarily mean someone is a good person. He seems extremely revenge-driven. Tony doesn't look like a bad person. When Laura saw the change in public opinion, she finally relaxed. She immediately reposted a vague social media update. "I believe time will prove everything." Her followers immediately began attacking George. Willow also saw it. After hesitating for a long time, she sent George a text message. "You can still turn back now. Apologize to Tony, and I can help speak for you." George looked at the message and almost laughed. He didn't reply. He simply saved a screenshot of the message. Tony's move was something he had expected long ago. In the original story, Tony's greatest strength was manipulating public opinion. First, he played the victim. Then, he guided the narrative. Finally, he turned the real victim into the villain. Unfortunately for him, this time, George was much better prepared. The next afternoon, George started a live stream. He sat inside the Ito Group's conference room, with his lawyer and several documents behind him. The moment the live stream began, comments flooded in with insults. "The painting theft issue hasn't even been explained yet. You still have the nerve to live stream? Are you trying to play the victim again?" George looked into the camera. His tone was calm. "Today isn't about playing the victim. It's about presenting evidence." The first piece of evidence was the complete surveillance footage of the so-called school bullying incident. In the video, George had indeed hit someone, but the truth was that 3 people had blocked him, stolen his drafts, and insulted him by saying he was an unwanted bastard. George had fought back, yet the edited version made it look like he had attacked them first. The second piece of evidence was the police record regarding the alleged theft incident. The person who reported it later admitted that they had falsely accused George after losing something and acting on impulse. The third piece of evidence was the original chat records from the alleged extortion incident. The screenshots showed that those threatening messages had never been sent by George. They had been fabricated by the other person and posted in the class group. George presented the evidence one piece at a time. The comments gradually became silent. Then, he released the final piece of evidence: the chat records between Tony and the PR company. The messages clearly stated, "Focus on attacking George's gloomy and twisted personality. Don't make direct false claims. Use words like suspected, rumors, and insiders say." Laura's side will cooperate by posting social media updates. At the end of the chat records was also a payment receipt. Payer, Tony. Chapter 15. The entire internet exploded. Laura's face turned deathly pale, and the phone nearly slipped from her hand. She had indeed reposted that social media update, but she had no idea that Tony had secretly paid for online commenters to manipulate public opinion. When Flora watched the live stream, her entire expression turned cold. She immediately called Tony. Tony answered quickly, his voice weak. "Eldest sister," Flora asked directly. "Were you the one who hired those online commenters?" Tony was silent for a moment. Then he started crying. "Eldest sister, I was just too scared. I was afraid brother would really destroy me. I didn't do it on purpose." Again, those words. "I didn't do it on purpose." For the first time, Flora found those words irritating. She said coldly, "Tony, you've disappointed me." The person on the other end froze. This was the first time Flora had spoken to him in such a tone. He panicked. "Eldest sister, are you abandoning me too?" Flora closed her eyes. If this had happened before, hearing those words would have made her soften immediately. But now, the only thing that appeared in her mind was what George had said. "Your so-called explanations always mean making me give in," Flora said. "I can't help you this time." She hung up. Tony sat on the hospital bed, his expression terrifyingly dark. He threw his phone against the wall with force. Why? Why had everyone started changing? Before, as long as he acted pitiful, Everyone in the Wang family would stand on his side. What exactly had George done? Tony's eyes gradually became vicious. Since George refused to let him go, then he couldn't blame Tony. Tony decided to take action. In the original story, he had eliminated George with a car accident. That night, George had gone to the outskirts because of a call from Willow. On the way, an out-of-control truck crashed into him. Everyone thought it was an accident. Only Tony knew that he had arranged it. This time, Tony planned to do it earlier, because George was growing too quickly. If he delayed any longer, the Wang family might truly be taken away by him. He contacted someone from the underground world. The man was named Billy, someone who specialized in handling dirty work. Tony offered $2 million. The request was simple: make George disappear. Billy asked, to what extent? Tony was silent for a few seconds. Then he said, make it look like an accident. After hanging up, Tony stood by the window. He said coldly, brother, you forced me into this. But he didn't know. From the very beginning, this phone call had already been under George's surveillance. Knowing the plot, George naturally knew that Tony would hire someone to kill him. So after the art exhibition, he had asked Makoto to keep an eye on several key figures. The moment Billy received the money, Makoto obtained the information. When Makoto handed the documents to George, his expression was grim. Your fake brother really wants you dead. George glanced through the documents. Expected. Makoto looked at him. You're not afraid at all? George said. Would being afraid help? Makoto fell silent. George handed the documents to his lawyer. Call the police, the lawyer asked. Now. George said. No, wait until they make their move. Makoto frowned. The risk is too high. George looked at him. I want them caught red-handed. Otherwise, Tony will say again that he didn't do it on purpose. Makoto stared at him for several seconds. I'll arrange for someone to follow you. George did not refuse. Chapter 16. 3 days later, George appeared at the abandoned warehouse in the northern part of the city as planned. It was the location arranged by Billy. He had deliberately sent George an anonymous email claiming that there was more evidence of Tony's crimes hidden there. In the original story, the original owner had been tricked into going there in exactly the same way. But this time, George went. Outside the abandoned warehouse, the night sky was gloomy. The moment George stepped inside, the iron door behind him slammed shut. Several men walked out from the shadows. The leader wore a cap and held an iron rod in his hand. Wang, don't blame us. George looked at them and asked, how much did Tony pay you? The man's expression changed. How do you know? George said, I also know he told you to make it look like an accident. The men finally realized something was wrong. Get him. Several people rushed forward at the same time. The next second, police sirens rang loudly outside the warehouse. The main door was smashed open. The police rushed in. Don't move. Before the men could react, they were already pinned to the ground. The leader's face turned deathly pale. Only then did he realize he had been the one trapped. George stood there, his expression calm. Makoto walked in from outside. Only after confirming George was unharmed did his expression slightly relax. You really don't value your own life? George replied. Of course I value my life. That's why I'm sending the people who want me dead behind bars. That night, Billy and the hired thugs were all arrested. The transfer records, chat history, call recordings, and action routes were all complete. The police quickly identified Tony Wang as the mastermind. The Wang family received the news at midnight. Walter and Sandra rushed to the hospital, only to see police officers questioning Tony inside the hospital room. Tony's face was pale. He desperately shook his head. It wasn't me. I didn't hire anyone to kill him. Dad, Mom, you have to believe me. Sandra could barely stand. Tony, tell Mom this isn't true. Tony cried. Mom, I really didn't do it. Laura also arrived. She wanted to protect Tony like she always had before. But this time, the police presented the evidence. The bank transfer records, the chat history, the call recordings. In the recording, Tony's voice was unmistakable. I want him gone. When Sandra heard that sentence, her entire body froze. Lillian's face turned pale. Flora closed her eyes, her fingers trembling slightly. Walter looked as if someone had slapped him hard across the face. He had always believed Tony was just insecure, that he only had some small schemes, but he never imagined Tony would actually dare to hire someone to kill, and the person he wanted to kill was the Wang family's biological son. When the police took Tony away, he finally broke down. Dad, Mom, eldest sister, second sister, third sister, save me. This time, no one moved. When Tony was taken out of the hospital room, he happened to see George standing at the end of the hallway. George stood there, his expression indifferent. Tony suddenly understood. It was you. George, you set me up. George looked at him. You hired someone to kill me. I called the police and had you arrested. And you call that setting you up? Tony went crazy and tried to rush toward him, but the police held him back. George, you'll die a horrible death. George's expression turned cold. Those words, the original George already heard them before. Tony froze. George stepped closer and spoke in a voice only the two of them could hear. When he died on that rainy night, you were laughing the same way, weren't you? Tony's pupils suddenly contracted. How did George know? How could he possibly know? George stepped back and said, "This time, it's your turn to pay it back." Tony was dragged away. For the first time, genuine fear appeared in his eyes. Chapter 17. After Tony was criminally detained, the Wang family's reputation completely collapsed. It had once only been a dispute between the real and fake heirs of a wealthy family fighting for affection. Now it had become a case of hiring someone to commit murder. The Wang Corporation's stock price continued to fall. Partners began waiting and watching. Walter was overwhelmed. What was worse, Ito Group took advantage of the situation and seized several key projects from the Wang Corporation, and the countermeasure plans for all of those projects had come from George. Flora looked at the company reports and felt powerless for the first time. She finally dug out the analysis report George had given her 3 months ago. The pages were already slightly wrinkled. The report clearly listed the risk points of several Wang Corporation projects. Half of them had already come true. After reading it, Flora's fingers turned cold. If she had seriously looked at it back then, if she hadn't thrown the report into a drawer just because of something Tony said, the Wang Corporation wouldn't have been so helpless now, and she wouldn't have only realized today how outstanding George truly was. Sandra's condition was even worse. Every day, she sat in the room George had once lived in, looking through the things the servants had organized. A jacket washed until the color had faded, several cheap pencils, an old sketchbook. Inside the sketchbook, there were several pages depicting the backs of the Wang family members. Walter sitting in his study, Flora in a meeting, Lillian holding medical records, Laura receiving an award on television, and her, Sandra sitting in the garden, lowering her head while trimming flowers. The drawings were simple, but every single one was carefully drawn. When Sandra reached the final page, tears suddenly fell. Written on the last page was one sentence: "When will they finally see me as family?" Sandra covered her mouth, crying so hard she couldn't speak. It turned out George hadn't been cold from the beginning. He had once hoped for their love too. It was they themselves who had personally destroyed that hope. Laura was also having a terrible time, because she had previously reposted social media content that encouraged her fans to attack George. She was now facing backlash from the entire internet. Brands terminated their contracts. Production teams suspended cooperation. Overnight, she went from a top actress to a laughingstock criticized by everyone. Her manager asked her, "Can you reconcile with George?" Laura remained silent for a long time. She picked up her phone and called George. No answer. She changed numbers. This time, it went through. After the call connected, Laura heard George's voice. "Who is this?" Her nose suddenly felt sour. In the past, George had always called her third sister. Even when she was impatient with him, he would still send her favorite desserts to the filming set. When she was injured during filming, he stayed outside the hospital all night, but she thought he embarrassed her and refused to let him come in. Thinking back now, there had been heavy rain that night. George must have been freezing while standing outside the hospital entrance. Laura's voice became hoarse. "It's me." George was silent for 2 seconds. "Do you need something?" Again. Those words. Laura's tears fell. "George, I'm sorry." The other end of the phone remained silent. Laura choked back sobs. "I shouldn't have said those things to you before. I shouldn't have smashed your phone. I shouldn't have helped Tony insult you. I know I was wrong." After listening, George's tone remained unchanged. "Are you done?" Laura froze. George said, "If you're done, then hang up." Laura panicked. "Wait. Can you forgive me just this once?" George let out a soft laugh. "Laura, do you know? The most ridiculous thing about you is that even now, you still think that as long as you apologize, I should forgive you." Laura's face turned pale. George continued, "I don't forgive you. Never." The call ended. Laura crouched on the ground, crying like a child. But this time, no one would turn back just because she shed tears. 1 month later, Tony's case officially entered the prosecution process. Artwork theft, malicious defamation, hiring someone to cause harm, multiple charges combined. The Wang family spent a great deal of money hiring lawyers, but the evidence chain was too complete. There was almost no possibility of turning the situation around. The Wang Corporation also reached its most dangerous moment. Ito Group joined forces with several capital groups to launch an acquisition. Walter resisted at first, until the banks demanded repayment. Partners withdrew their investments. Core projects came to a standstill. Only then did he finally have no choice but to accept negotiations. Chapter 18. The negotiation took place in the top-floor conference room of the Wang Corporation. Walter sat in the main seat, looking much more haggard than before. Flora sat beside him. Sandra had also come. Laura wore a hat and mask, her eyes swollen and red. Lillian remained silent. They all knew Ito Group would come, but they never expected the person who walked into the conference room to be George. He wore a sharply tailored black suit, his figure slender, his expression cold and distant. Behind him followed Makoto and the legal team. Walter suddenly stood up in shock. "How is it you?" George sat down and smiled. "Mr. Wang." Surprised. Walter's face turned grim. "The Ito Group's acquisition of the Wang Corporation was your idea," George said. "To be precise, it was my plan." Walter's fingers trembled. "Do you even remember that your surname is Wang?" George looked at him. "My surname is Wang, but I'm not the Wang from your family." Walter was speechless. Sandra's eyes instantly turned red. "George, don't be like this." George didn't look at her. "Mrs. Sandra, don't use emotions as a negotiation tactic. You never gave me much affection before either." Sandra's face turned deathly pale. Flora said softly, "George, the Wang Corporation is Dad's life's work." George opened the documents. "Then you can choose not to sell." Flora smiled bitterly. Did they really have a choice? No. George understood the Wang Corporation's weaknesses too well. Every move he made struck exactly where it hurt most. Walter stared at him and suddenly asked, "You're doing all this just to take revenge on us?" George replied calmly, "At first, yes, but not anymore." Walter frowned. George said, "Now it's simply business. The Wang Corporation still has value. I'll acquire it and restructure it. As for your emotions, they are not included in my valuation." Walter looked as if he had aged 10 years in an instant. He had once looked down on this son. He thought George was crude, gloomy, and unfit for high society. But now, the son he had looked down upon was sitting across from him, deciding the fate of the Wang family. Sandra finally couldn't hold back her tears. "George, Mom really knows she was wrong. Come home." "Okay. We'll give Tony's room to you. Mom will definitely make it up to you from now on." George finally looked at her. "Sandra." This was the first time he had called her by her full name. "You still don't understand. I don't want Tony's room, and I don't want your late arriving maternal love." Sandra's tears streamed down her face. "Then what do you want?" George looked at her and said word by word, "I want you to remember forever that you were the ones who personally lost your own biological son." The conference room fell into complete silence. Laura cried, "George, I'm sorry." "Third sister really?" George interrupted her. "Don't call yourself that. I don't have any sisters." Laura trembled all over. Lillian's eyes turned red, but she couldn't say a single word. She wanted to apologize, but she knew an apology was meaningless now. Flora looked at George and suddenly asked softly, "If we had treated you better back then, would you have stayed?" George fell silent for a moment. He thought of the original George, the young man who had written on the final page of his sketchbook, "When will they finally see me as family?" If they had shown him even a little sincerity back then, maybe he really would have stayed. But there was no such thing as if. George said, "Yes." Flora's tears instantly fell. That was the cruelest answer, because they truly had a chance. They were the ones who chose to throw it away. In the end, the Wang Corporation signed the acquisition agreement. Walter surrendered his controlling stake. The Wang family officially lost the Wang Corporation. At the moment of signing, Sandra looked at George as if she wanted to hold onto something for the last time. "George, will you ever come home again?" George put away the contract. "No, that place was never my home." Chapter 19. He stood up and walked toward the door, but suddenly stopped. Everyone in the Wang family looked up at him. George did not turn around. "By the way, I won't be issuing a letter of forgiveness for Tony's case. What he owed the old George, it's time for him to pay it back." After saying that, he pushed open the door and left. The sunlight outside was bright. Makoto was waiting for him in the hallway. "Is it over?" George nodded. "It's over." Makoto clicked his tongue and asked, "Do you regret it?" George smiled faintly. "The person who should regret it isn't me." He stepped into the elevator. The doors slowly closed. The Wang family remained in the conference room. Sandra finally broke down and burst into tears. Walter sat in his chair, silent for a long time. Flora lowered her head and stared at the acquisition agreement on the table, tears falling onto the paper one by one. Laura cried so hard she could barely breathe. Lillian closed her eyes, her mind filled with the image of George once standing at the Wang family's door, carefully calling her second sister, but that person would never come back again. Chapter 20. Half a year later, Tony was sentenced. On the day the verdict was announced, not a single member of the Wang family went to attend the hearing. Sandra fell seriously ill. Walter completely stepped back from the spotlight. Flora stayed to work in the new group. Her position reduced from vice president to department head. Laura's attempt at a comeback failed, and she moved behind the scenes instead. Lillian resigned from her hospital administrative position and returned to frontline medical work. They were all trying to atone in their own ways, but George never saw them again. He founded his own studio. He painted, invested, and worked on projects. After being re-signed under a new name, Return to the Nest was collected by overseas art museums. When the media interviewed him, they asked, "Mr. Wang, many people say you turned a rich family revenge fantasy into reality. What do you think about that?" George Wang smiled. "It wasn't revenge. I was simply taking back what belonged to me." The reporter asked again, "Then will you reconcile with the Wang family someday?" George looked at the camera and calmly said, "No. Some wounds cannot be erased with an apology. Some people are not worth looking back for." After the interview aired, Sandra watched it countless times. She cried as she watched. The George on television was cold, composed, and dazzling. That was her biological son, but she no longer had the right to get close to him. Flora saved a copy of the interview. Laura secretly followed George's studio account, yet never dared to leave a like. Every year, Lillian sent George a birthday gift, but every single time, the gifts were returned exactly as they were. They finally understood. George's decision to cut ties was not something he had said out of anger. He had truly severed their relationship. When winter arrived, a snowfall-covered city A, George stood by the studio window, watching the snow outside. Makoto walked in and placed a new project contract on his desk. "A new project. Want to take a look?" George picked it up. Of course. Makoto looked at him and suddenly asked, "Are you happy now?" George's hand stopped as he flipped through the documents. He thought for a moment. "Not bad." Makoto smiled. "That answer really sounds like you." George smiled slightly as well. He lowered his gaze to the sketchbook beside the desk. It was the old notebook left behind by the original George. On the last page, the sentence, "When will they finally see me as family?" had already been gently crossed out. Beside it, he had written a new sentence, "I don't need them anymore." Outside the window, snow fell silently. George closed the sketchbook. The boy from the past who had longed to be loved was finally no longer trapped in the shadow of the Wang family. From now on, he would no longer be anyone's son, no longer anyone's brother, no longer anyone's fiancé, and no longer anyone's simp. He was simply George, George who belonged only to himself.